Welcome to Tolkien 101, my new series where we're going to tackle some of the most common questions and misconceptions that fans have about Middle-earth. As I've said many times, my first exposure to Tolkien was the Fellowship of the Ring film, so for many years, I solely envisioned Balrogs having wings. Today, we'll look at the passages that apply to Balrogs, and I'll show you how I was convinced that Balrogs do not have wings. Now, we need to address a big issue that you're going to see with these passages. It's that they're all very susceptible to confirmation bias. If you go into them convinced that Balrogs have wings, you'll read them very differently than if you had no preconceived notion regarding these creatures. So do your best to come into this discussion with a blank canvas. We'll begin with the most well-known passage involving a Balrog, when the Fellowship faces Durin's Bane at the Bridge of Khazad-dum. As Gandalf faces off with the Servant of Morgoth, Tolkien states, "His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like two vast wings." This first use of the word wings is a clear case of simile. Now, if you don't remember this from your school days, simile is similar to a metaphor, but it specifically compares two things, often using the term like or as. In this case, Tolkien is stating the shadow around the Balrog is like two vast wings. Shortly after this line, we get another reference to wings. Suddenly, it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. This is the primary phrase that many will point to as evidence the Balrog has wings. However, this line, coming shortly after the established simile, is actually a literary device Tolkien uses from time to time. In this case, Tolkien is using a metaphor. These metaphorical wings are in fact the shadow that emanates about the Balrog, not literal wings. Another example comes in the Silmarillion, leading up to the downfall of Numenor, as Manwe sends forth a warning. And out of the west there would be at times a great cloud in the evening, shaped as it were an eagle, with pinions spread to the north and the south, and slowly it would loom up, blotting out the sunset, and then uttermost night would fall upon Numenor, and some of the eagles bore lightning beneath their wings, and thunder echoed between sea and cloud. In this case, Tolkien uses simile to describe the great cloud being as, or like, an eagle. This is followed by a metaphor, as the eagles bore lightning beneath their wings. If you were reading this for the first time, you wouldn't believe that the clouds suddenly became actual eagles, with lightning coming from beneath their wings. This is once again Tolkien's use of a simile followed by a metaphor to create a striking image in the reader's mind, just like with the wings of shadow for a Balrog. Another passage that pro-wingers will point to comes in the History of Middle-earth Volume 10, Morgoth's Ring. This quote comes after Ungoliant turns on Morgoth, and he yells out, summoning the Balrogs from Angband. These collected notes of Tolkien state, "Swiftly they arose, and they passed with winged speed over Hithlum, and they came to Lamoth as a tempest of fire." Some will point to Tolkien's use of the word winged here as evidence the Balrogs have wings. However, it's important to note the word immediately following, making the complete phrase winged speed. This is yet another example where confirmation bias comes into play. Allow me to demonstrate. If we substitute another creature, let's see how it changes the interpretation. If we said the eagles passed with winged speed over Hithlum, you would naturally and rightfully conclude that the eagles would be using their wings. However, if you said a horse passed with winged speed, you would understand that this use of winged is a metaphor to describe the speed as being very fast. Another instance that leads some to believe Balrogs have wings comes in Appendix A in the section on Durin's folk. "Thus the dwarves roused from sleep a thing of terror, that flying from Thangorodrim had lain hidden at the foundations of the earth since the coming of the host of the west, a Balrog of Morgoth." In my mind, this is possibly the most compelling evidence for the pro-wing crowd. The obvious word of interest here is flying, but we should keep something in mind here. Tolkien uses the term fly to mean flee all the time. Obviously, we have the most well-known example, "Fly, you fools," but But if you've read the books, you will find that the words fly, flying, and flight are used throughout Tolkien's works in reference to fleeing or retreating. To back this up, I looked at the Fellowship of the Ring and counted a total of 48 uses of the terms fly, flying, and flight. 2 are purely metaphorical, speaking of hair flying loose and the sounds of the elves. 6 are referring to flights of stairs in Moria. 15 are referring to traveling by air. And more than half, 25 times, it refers to fleeing. Now, what do we know about the conditions of this Balrog's trip from Thangorodrim to the Misty Mountains, where he hides for thousands of years? His flight would have taken place in the waning days of the War of Wrath, with Morgoth's forces facing certain defeat. Morgoth is cowering in his fortress, and according to Tolkien himself, this Balrog is the only survivor of the original, at most, 7 Balrogs. This journey of the Balrog is the very definition of fleeing. It is fleeing the battle, fleeing defeat, and likely fleeing certain death. Finally, there's another piece of evidence that the Balrogs were not winged coming from this same time period. From 545 to 587, the greatest battle in the history of Arda takes place, the previously mentioned War of Wrath, between the host of Valinor and what we are told is an uncountable force of Morgoth. Now, during the waning years of this conflict, Morgoth is staring defeat in the face, so he plays his last card, unleashing the winged dragons. We are told this is the first time the winged dragons had ever been seen. In the ensuing devastation, the host of Valinor is driven back. As our friend Corey Olsen, the Tolkien professor, said in our recent interview, the reason that this is such a big deal is because Morgoth never previously had, for lack of a better term, an air force. Now, you could argue that the host of the West was driven back by the fact dragons can breathe fire. And yes, that was definitely a contributing factor. However, it's worth noting that it's only after Erendil arrives in his flying ship, along with the Great Eagles, that the tide of battle turns. It's not that Erendil or the Eagles breathe fire or have some special skill to combat the flames, but the fact that they fly that allows them to even the odds. We must keep in mind that by the War of Wrath, dragons have been around for nearly 200 years, so the forces of good would be well aware of their fire-breathing ability, and could prepare for such attacks. Likewise, if Balrogs, who were also well known by this time, were capable of flight, the host of Valinor would no doubt have plans in place to combat winged creatures, and not have been caught so off guard by the winged dragons. Going back even further, we'll take a look at some of Tolkien's earliest notes on Middle-earth. In the earlier versions of The Fall of Gondolin, back when Melkor was actually known as Melko, Tolkien actually wrote about the ability of flight being elusive to the Dark Lord. In these writings, it describes Melko capturing the eagles and chaining them against sharp rocks and attempting to steal the ability of flight through magic. When the eagles would not reveal the secret, he would cut their wings off in an attempt to utilize them himself, which failed. Now, clearly this is an older version of the story and it isn't canon, as Melkor's name isn't even the same. But it does give us the sense that in the early days at least, Tolkien saw Morgoth's forces as earthbound, which, if this element held over, would make the reveal of the winged dragons even more of a big deal, as Morgoth had finally discovered the secret of flight to terrible effect. Finally, there's one last point of consideration. If Morgoth's servants, demons of fire and shadow, had wings and were capable of flight, why would they be so well known for falling from high places? We are told of the deaths of exactly 3 Balrogs, and all 3 involve falling. First, we have Gothmog, the Lord of Balrogs, who is stabbed by the elf lord Ecthelion as they both fall from the wall of Gondolin and into the fountain of the city, where Gothmog's fire is extinguished and they both drown. Second, as refugees of Gondolin are fleeing the city, a Balrog attacks. Glorfindel fights the Balrog upon a high precipice in the mountains. We are told that they both perish as they fall into the abyss. And finally, we have Durin's Bane, who falls when Gandalf breaks the bridge of Khazad-dum. For supposed winged creatures of immense power, These Balrogs sure do fall from high places a lot. There is one thing I will admit as I conclude my case for why Balrogs don't have wings. Balrogs look really cool with wings. Middle-earth artwork is chock full of interpretations of Balrogs, both winged and wingless, and they look incredible both ways. I'll never be one to complain about an epic rendition of a winged Balrog. So now I turn it to you. How do you prefer your Balrogs? Have I convinced you of Tolkien's original intent? And what would you like to see covered on future episodes of my Tolkien 101 series? Let me know in the comments. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to my Patreon supporters, including Tom DeBombadil19, Gail Elizabeth, Jim Limber Davis, Sky Carcass, Salim Rahman, Smorzerk, Zetrock, Gimmelkad, Grand Strategy Nerd, Debbie, Chief 40123, Mid-Earth Wellness, and the Dark-Haired One. Thanks so much for watching and subscribing, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.